The room went silent when Rachel Harper unfolded the paper. Not because of what it said. Because of what it didn't. Her grandfather had spent 72 years building one of the largest private land portfolios in southern Indiana. Hundreds of acres. Commercial properties. Timber rights. Investments nobody in the family fully understood. Everyone expected millions. Rachel expected nothing. Yet somehow, when the attorney finished reading the will, every eye in the room turned toward her. The old man had left her exactly $1. One single dollar. And then, in neat handwriting beneath the official document, a short note. For Rachel. You'll understand when the time is right. The silence lasted only a second. Then came the laughter. Not loud at first. Just a few chuckles. A smirk from an uncle. A cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh from her cousin. Then somebody whispered something. And suddenly the room was full of amusement. Rachel sat frozen in her chair. The dollar bill felt strangely heavy in her hand. Across the polished conference table, her ex-husband Drew leaned back and shook his head. Well, he muttered. Looks like Grandpa really knew how to make a point. A few people laughed again. Rachel lowered her eyes. The dollar was old. Not antique. Just worn. Its edges were soft. Its paper carried that faint smell of age and dust that clings to forgotten drawers and old family Bibles. For reasons she couldn't explain, she slipped it carefully into her purse. The rest of the family barely noticed. To them, it was a joke. To Rachel, it felt unfinished. And sometimes, I've noticed, the things that feel unfinished have a way of following us home. The attorney continued reading the will. Properties were assigned. Trusts were distributed. Investments were divided. Names were called. Millions of dollars moved around the room through signatures and legal language. Rachel heard almost none of it. She kept thinking about the note. You'll understand when the time is right. Not if. When. There is a difference. A very important one. I've lived long enough to know that older people often speak in puzzles when they're afraid the truth won't be heard any other way. Sometimes a secret needs time before it can reveal itself. Sometimes a gift arrives wearing the clothes of a disappointment. Rachel wouldn't understand that yet. Not that afternoon. Not while her life was quietly falling apart. 3 weeks later, she lost custody of her son. At least that's how it felt. The court order wasn't absolute. She still had visitation rights. She still had weekends. Birthdays. Certain holidays. But when the judge finalized primary custody with Drew, Rachel walked out of the courthouse feeling as though someone had reached inside her chest and removed something vital. The November wind cut through downtown Indianapolis as she stood on the courthouse steps. Cars rolled past. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued. It always does. No matter what happens to us. Rachel sat alone on a cold bench for nearly an hour. Her phone buzzed several times. Friends. Coworkers. Her sister. She ignored every call. The only sound she heard was the rustle of dry leaves scraping across concrete. Years later she would remember that sound more vividly than the judge's words. Memory is funny that way. It keeps strange souvenirs. Her apartment felt emptier than usual that night. A half-finished school project still sat on the kitchen table. One of Ethan's sneakers remained near the front door. A blue one. Size 3. Rachel stared at it longer than she should have. Then she carried it into his room and placed it beside its matching shoe. The room smelled faintly of crayons and laundry detergent. The dinosaur blanket remained folded at the foot of the bed. A small baseball glove rested on the dresser. Everything waited for a child who wasn't there. Rachel sat on the edge of the mattress. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Inside, the coffee she'd made hours earlier had gone cold. She wrapped both hands around the mug anyway. Not for warmth. Just for something to hold. Eventually the tears came. Not dramatic tears. Not movie tears. Just exhaustion. The kind that arrives when someone has spent too long pretending they're stronger than they feel. She cried until her shoulders hurt. Until her eyes burned. Until there was nothing left. For the first time in her life, Rachel truly believed she had lost everything that mattered. And perhaps that was why she finally noticed the envelope. It had been sitting on the kitchen counter all week. Unopened. Forgotten among bills and advertisements. A plain white envelope. No return address. Only her name written across the front in familiar handwriting. Her grandfather's. Rachel wiped her eyes. The rain continued outside. Slow. Steady. Patient. She reached for the envelope. And somewhere deep inside, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months stirred quietly. Not hope. Not yet. Just curiosity. Sometimes curiosity is all hope needs to begin. Rachel carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. And a small brass key. The metal felt cold against her fingertips. Attached to it was a handwritten message. Only 6 words. Start where the bread was baked. Rachel stared at the note. Confused. Breathless. Wondering what it meant. Wondering why her grandfather had waited until after his death to send it. Wondering why a man worth millions had left her $1 and a key. And without realizing it, she had just taken the first step toward a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. Rachel barely slept that night. The brass key sat on her kitchen table beside the old dollar bill. Every time she passed by, she found herself looking at them again. The key wasn't fancy. No jewels. No markings she could recognize. Just old brass worn smooth by decades of use. The kind of key that belonged to another era. The kind people rarely carried anymore. Outside, the rain continued until nearly dawn. By morning, the clouds hung low over Indianapolis, turning everything gray. Rachel poured herself a cup of coffee and unfolded the note again. Start where the bread was baked. She read it 6 times. Then 10. The words didn't change. Neither did the confusion. But something about them felt familiar. Not immediately. Not logically. More like a memory standing just beyond reach. I've noticed that memories often behave that way. The important ones rarely arrive when we demand them. They appear quietly while we're washing dishes or staring through a rainy window. They wait until we're ready. Rachel carried the coffee to the window. The bitter taste lingered on her tongue. She watched a school bus roll down the street. Children climbed aboard. Parents waved goodbye. Normal life. The kind of life that suddenly feels very far away when your own world has fallen apart. Then the memory arrived. Not all at once. Just a small piece. A smell. Fresh bread. Warm yeast. Butter melting into thick slices. Her grandfather's bakery. Rachel froze. The bakery had closed more than 20 years ago. Most people in town barely remembered it. Before the land deals. Before the investments. Before the wealth. Harold Whitaker had owned a tiny bakery on the edge of Hawthorne County. That was where he'd started. That was where he'd baked bread every morning before sunrise. That was where the bread was baked. Rachel looked down at the key. Her heart beat a little faster. For the first time since opening the envelope, she had somewhere to begin. 2 days later she'd borrowed her sister's pickup truck. The drive took nearly 3 hours. Cornfields stretched across the countryside. Bare trees lined the roads. The November sky remained pale and colorless. As Rachel drove, memories surfaced one after another. Summer afternoons. The smell of cinnamon rolls. her grandfather lifting her onto a stool behind the bakery counter. The warmth of the ovens. The old radio playing country music somewhere in the back. She hadn't thought about those moments in years. Sometimes life buries memories beneath responsibilities. Jobs. Bills. Marriages. Divorces. Courtrooms. Then suddenly one small thing, a smell, a song, a handwritten note, uncovers everything. By noon she reached Hawthorne County. The town looked smaller than she remembered. Most childhood places do. The grocery store had changed ownership. The hardware store had a new sign. The old movie theater was boarded up. Time had moved forward. As it always does. But not everything had disappeared. When Rachel turned onto Maple Street, she found herself slowing down. The bakery was still there. Or at least the building was. The faded brick structure sat quietly between an antique store and a vacant lot. Its windows were covered with dust. The sign had long since vanished. Yet Rachel recognized it instantly. A strange ache settled in her chest. For a moment she simply sat behind the steering wheel. Listening. The engine ticking. Wind brushing against the truck. The distant cry of a crow. Then she stepped outside. The cold air stung her cheeks. She approached the front door. Locked. No surprise there. She walked around the building. The alley behind it looked exactly as she remembered. An old loading dock. Cracked concrete. Rusted metal railing. And a narrow wooden door. Rachel stopped. The brass key felt cold in her hand. For several seconds she simply stared at the lock. Breathing slowly. Thinking. There are moments in life when you can feel a story changing direction. This felt like one of those moments. Not because she knew what was waiting inside. Because she didn't. The unknown has a way of making ordinary things feel sacred. Rachel slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. Her pulse quickened. She turned it. Click. The sound echoed softly in the alley. The door opened. The smell hit her first. Dust. Old wood. A faint trace of flour. Time itself seemed trapped inside the building. Sunlight slipped through dirty windows. Particles drifted through the air like tiny floating memories. Rachel stepped carefully inside. The bakery had been abandoned for decades. Yet somehow it still felt alive. The old display cases remained. Shelves lined the walls. A rusted mixer sat in one corner. Everything wore a blanket of dust. Everything except one thing. A wooden table near the back. Its surface was noticeably cleaner. Rachel frowned. Someone had been here. Recently. A chill moved through her. Not fear exactly. Awareness. She approached slowly. At the center of the table sat a small metal box. Waiting. The box looked old. Handmade. The same brass color as the key. Attached to it was another note. This one carried her grandfather's handwriting. Rachel's throat tightened. She carefully unfolded the paper. Inside were only 2 sentences. If you found this, you're closer than the rest of them ever were. And if Victor learns you found it, be careful. Rachel stared at the words. Victor. The name meant something. A distant memory. A face from family gatherings. One of her grandfather's former business partners. A man she hadn't seen in years. A man who had attended the funeral. A man who seemed strangely interested in the will. Suddenly the room felt colder. The mystery she had inherited was no longer just a puzzle. Someone else knew about it. Someone else wanted something. And for the first time, Rachel began to wonder whether the dollar, the key, and the bakery were leading her toward a fortune. Or toward a danger her grandfather had tried desperately to keep hidden. She reached toward the metal box. and slowly lifted the lid. Rachel lifted the lid slowly. The hinges groaned from years of neglect. For a moment, she expected something dramatic. Stacks of cash. Property deeds. A map leading to hidden wealth. Instead, she found something far smaller. And somehow far more personal. Inside the metal box sat a photograph. A folded letter. And a silver dollar coin. Nothing else. Rachel stared at the contents. The disappointment came first. Then curiosity. The photograph looked old. Its edges had yellowed with age. She picked it up carefully. The image showed a younger version of her grandfather standing outside the bakery. Snow covered the sidewalk. A Christmas wreath hung in the window. Beside him stood a little girl wearing a red coat. Rachel. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her grandfather was kneeling beside her, holding her small hand in his. Both were smiling. For several seconds she simply looked at the picture. The bakery disappeared around her. The dusty walls. The mystery. The warnings. All of it faded. Because suddenly she could smell cinnamon again. Fresh bread. Hot chocolate. The scent of butter melting onto warm rolls. Memory arrived before emotion. It always does. One moment you're holding a photograph. The next, you're standing inside a forgotten piece of your own life. Rachel swallowed hard. A tear slipped down her cheek before she realized it. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. You were always different, Rachel. Never forget that. She closed her eyes. Just for a second. The words hurt more than she expected. Not because they were sad. Because they arrived at a moment when she desperately needed someone to believe in her. After the custody hearing. After the divorce. After months of feeling like a failure. There are seasons in life when a single kind sentence feels more valuable than money. I've seen it happen countless times. A person can survive hardship longer than they can survive hopelessness. And sometimes hope arrives through something as simple as a photograph. Rachel carefully placed the picture back inside the box. Then she unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the page. Not neat. Not polished. Just honest. Rachel. If you're reading this, then you've done something nobody else in our family was willing to do. You were curious. Most people spend their lives chasing answers they already expect to find. You kept looking. Rachel smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like him. The letter continued. I know your life is difficult right now. I know you've lost more than anyone realizes. Rachel stopped reading. A chill passed through her. How could he have known? Then she remembered. The letter had likely been written years ago. Long before the divorce. Long before the custody battle. Yet somehow the words felt personal. Almost immediate. As if he were sitting beside her now. I've often thought that love has a strange relationship with time. The people who truly know us sometimes leave behind words that continue speaking long after they're gone. Rachel continued reading. The family believes wealth is what I wanted to leave behind. They are wrong. Money changes hands. Land changes owners. Buildings crumble. The only inheritance that matters is purpose. Rachel sat quietly. The old bakery creaked around her. Wind brushed against the building outside. Somewhere a loose piece of metal rattled softly. The world seemed to pause. Then she reached the final lines. The coin will show you where to go next. Trust no one until you understand why Victor is searching. Especially Victor himself. Rachel looked down at the silver dollar. The coin suddenly felt much heavier. The silver dollar was older than the bill she'd inherited. Much older. Its surface had worn smooth over decades. When she turned it over, she noticed something unusual. Tiny markings scratched into the edge. Not random scratches. Letters. Coordinates. Rachel frowned. Someone had engraved them carefully. Latitude. Longitude. A location. She pulled out her phone. The signal inside the bakery was weak, but enough. After several attempts, the map loaded. The coordinates pointed somewhere roughly 20 miles outside town. Deep in the countryside. Near an area called Hawthorne Haven. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Yet Rachel couldn't remember why. She zoomed in. The location appeared surrounded by woods. No major roads. No businesses. Nothing remarkable. Just a small patch of land hidden among hundreds of acres. A strange place for a clue. And yet her grandfather had clearly wanted her to find it. Rachel slipped the coin into her coat pocket. Then she checked the box again. That was when she noticed something she had missed. A false bottom. The discovery almost seemed accidental. Her finger brushed a loose corner. The panel shifted slightly. Rachel carefully lifted it. Beneath it rested another envelope. Smaller this time. Thinner. Inside was a single document. A newspaper clipping. 28 years old. The headline read, "Local investor saves senior community from closure." Rachel stared. Below the headline was a photograph. The picture showed several elderly residents standing outside a modest community building. And there, near the center, stood her grandfather. Beside him stood Victor. Much younger. Much thinner. Smiling. Partners. The article described how the two men had worked together to rescue a struggling retirement community known as Hawthorne Haven. Rachel's stomach tightened. The same location from the coordinates. The same name. The same Victor her grandfather had warned her about. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Why had Victor once helped save the community? Why had they worked together? What had happened between them? And why was Victor now being treated like a threat? The easy answer would have been greed. But life is rarely that simple. People don't usually wake up one morning and become villains. Something changes. Something breaks. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes all at once. Whatever had happened between those two men, Rachel suspected the story was far older than anyone realized. As she folded the newspaper clipping, her phone suddenly vibrated. The sound echoed through the empty bakery. Unknown number. Rachel hesitated. Then answered. Hello? For several seconds, silence. Then a man's voice. Calm. Measured. Older. Rachel Harper. Her grip tightened. Who is this? Another pause. Then the answer. Someone who knew your grandfather. The voice remained polite. Almost friendly. Which somehow felt worse. I heard you've been asking questions. Rachel's pulse quickened. The cold air suddenly felt colder. Who is this? She repeated. This time the answer came immediately. Victor. Silence filled the room. The name seemed to settle into every corner of the abandoned bakery. Rachel remembered the warning. Be careful. Victor spoke again. You found the bakery sooner than I expected. A knot formed in Rachel's stomach. Because there was only one way Victor could know that. Someone had been watching. Rachel's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the wind outside. She stood alone in the abandoned bakery, gripping her phone. The smell of dust and old wood suddenly felt heavier. Different. As if the building itself had become aware of the conversation. You've been watching me? She asked. Victor laughed softly. Not cruelly. Not mockingly. More like a man who had expected the question. Watching is a strong word. Rachel glanced toward the dirty windows. Toward the alley. Toward the empty street beyond. A few minutes earlier she had felt alone. Now she wasn't so sure. The feeling made her skin crawl. Victor spoke again. Your grandfather knew you would come. Rachel didn't answer. He always believed you'd be the one. The words caught her attention despite herself. The one for what? A pause. Long enough to make her wonder whether he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older. Tired. The one willing to keep digging. Then the line went silent. Not disconnected. Just silent. As if Victor was deciding how much truth to reveal. I've lived long enough to recognize that kind of silence. It usually appears when someone is standing between honesty and self-protection. Most people think secrets are built from lies. Many aren't. Many are built from partial truths. Those can be much harder to recognize. Finally Victor spoke. Leave Hawthorne Haven alone. Rachel's stomach tightened. You know about the coordinates. I know more than you think. The answer came immediately. Too immediately. That frightened her more than anything else. Because it meant Victor wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what she had found. The newspaper clipping. The coin. The bakery. Maybe even the box itself. Rachel lowered her voice. What happened between you and my grandfather? For several seconds, nothing. Then Victor sighed. A weary sound. The kind that comes from carrying something too long. We built something together. What? Another pause. Hawthorne Haven. Rachel glanced at the newspaper clipping. The faded photograph. The smiling faces. The younger version of Victor standing beside her grandfather. If someone had shown her that picture yesterday, she would have assumed they were friends. Partners. Perhaps even family. Now she wasn't sure what to believe. Victor's voice hardened slightly. Some things are better left buried. Then the call ended. Just like that. No goodbye. No explanation. Only silence. Rachel stood motionless for nearly a minute. The old bakery creaked softly around her. Wind rattled something loose on the roof. A truck passed somewhere outside. Life continued. Yet everything felt different now. The mystery had changed shape. Before, it had felt like a treasure hunt. A puzzle left behind by a loving grandfather. Now another element had entered the story. Fear. Not overwhelming fear. Not panic. Just enough uncertainty to make every clue feel sharper. Every decision heavier. Rachel carefully packed the photograph, the letter, and the newspaper clipping into her bag. Then she locked the bakery door behind her and headed toward the truck. The sky had darkened. Heavy clouds rolled across the countryside. Rain seemed inevitable. As she drove toward Hawthorne Haven, she found herself thinking about her grandfather. About the man everyone remembered after he became wealthy. The investor. The businessman. The landowner. But not the baker. Not the young man who woke before dawn to knead dough. Not the man who spent decades quietly helping people. Sometimes families remember success and forget character. They remember numbers and overlook sacrifices. I've seen that happen more times than I can count. And often the most important chapters are the ones nobody talks about anymore. The road to Hawthorne Haven narrowed as Rachel left the highway. Fields gave way to woods. The farther she drove, the fewer houses she saw. Rain finally began falling. Soft at first. Then harder. The windshield wipers worked steadily. Back and forth. Back and forth. The rhythmic sound gave her too much time to think. Which wasn't always a good thing. Her mind drifted toward Ethan. Her son. She imagined him eating dinner with Drew. Watching cartoons. Getting ready for bed. Without her. The thought settled heavily in her chest. The custody ruling still felt unreal. Some wounds don't arrive all at once. They reveal themselves little by little. A quiet moment. An empty bedroom. An unused toothbrush. A missing voice at the dinner table. That's often how grief works. Rachel reached for the coffee she'd bought at a gas station earlier. It had gone cold. She took a sip anyway. Bitter. Unpleasant. Yet familiar. Life had felt a lot like that recently. Then her phone rang. Drew. For a moment she considered ignoring it. Instead she answered. Hi. His voice sounded different. Less confident than usual. Less certain. Rachel. Neither spoke for a second. Rain tapped against the windshield. I talked to Ethan. Rachel swallowed. Okay. He misses you. The words hurt more than she expected. Because she missed him too. Every hour. Every day. Drew exhaled slowly. I thought this would make things easier. Rachel frowned. What would? The custody arrangement. For the first time since the divorce, uncertainty crept into his voice. A small crack in the certainty he'd carried through court. Rachel listened. Surprised. I don't know, Drew admitted. Maybe nobody wins these things. The statement hung there between them. Awkward. Incomplete. Human. That was something Rachel had forgotten recently. Drew wasn't simply the man who hurt her. He was also a father trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. People are rarely only one thing. That doesn't excuse the damage they cause. But it explains why life is more complicated than stories often make it seem. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Neither felt better. Yet neither felt quite as angry. And sometimes that's enough. The rain intensified as Rachel finally reached the coordinates. The GPS announced her arrival. She looked through the windshield. At first she thought she had made a mistake. Then she saw the sign. Partially hidden behind trees. Weathered. Faded. Yet still readable. Hawthorne Haven. Rachel stared. The retirement community was much larger than she expected. Several brick buildings stood among towering oak trees. Walking paths wound through the property. Porches glowed softly beneath warm lights. Despite the storm, the place felt welcoming. Alive. Loved. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Home. As Rachel parked near the entrance, something unexpected happened. People were waiting. At least a dozen elderly residents stood beneath the covered front porch. Watching. Waiting. Some held umbrellas. Others leaned on canes. One woman clutched a tissue. A tall man removed his cap. Rachel frowned. Confused. She stepped from the truck. Rain splashed against the pavement. The residents exchanged nervous glances. Then an elderly woman slowly walked forward. Tears filled her eyes. She looked directly at Rachel. And whispered 4 words that made Rachel's blood run cold. You're finally here. For a moment, Rachel simply stood in the rain. Water dripped from her coat sleeves. The cold November wind tugged at her hair. And across the parking lot, a dozen strangers looked at her as though they had been expecting her for years. The elderly woman who had spoken stepped closer. She appeared to be in her late 70s. Silver hair. Kind eyes. A navy cardigan buttoned neatly despite the storm. Behind her stood the others. Watching. Waiting. Hoping. Rachel didn't understand any of it. I'm sorry, she said softly. Do I know you? The woman smiled sadly. No. Then she glanced toward the main building. But your grandfather did. A strange silence settled between them. The rain continued falling around the group. Rachel suddenly became aware of the smell of wet leaves and damp earth. The scent reminded her of childhood autumns. Of football games. Of pumpkin pies cooling on kitchen counters. Of her grandfather driving her through country roads while old country songs played on the radio. Memories have a way of arriving when we least expect them. Sometimes they feel like visitors. Quiet reminders that the past is never as far away as we imagine. The woman extended her hand. "My name is Margaret." Rachel shook it. Margaret's fingers felt cold from the weather. Yet her grip was steady. "Come inside," Margaret said. "We've been waiting a very long time." The lobby of Hawthorne Haven felt warm compared to the storm outside. A stone fireplace crackled gently in one corner. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. Someone had recently baked cookies. Chocolate chip. Rachel could smell them immediately. The simple scent stirred another memory. Her grandfather used to insist that every good meeting required coffee and something sweet. He claimed difficult conversations became easier when people shared food. At the time, Rachel thought it was just one of his strange habits. Years later, she wasn't so sure. The residents gathered around her. Not aggressively. Not suspiciously. If anything, they seemed nervous. As though they were afraid she might disappear. Margaret led her toward a small sitting room. Family photographs decorated the walls. Holiday celebrations. Birthday parties. Picnics. Community events. It didn't feel like a business. It felt like a family. Rachel sat carefully in an armchair. The residents remained standing. That made her uncomfortable. "Can somebody please tell me what's going on?" she asked. The room grew quiet. Several people exchanged glances. Finally, an older man with a cane stepped forward. His name was Frank. At least 80 years old. Maybe older. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Harold told us you'd come." Rachel blinked. "My grandfather?" Frank nodded. "Years ago." The answer made no sense. "Years ago?" Another resident laughed softly. "We know how that sounds." Rachel certainly did. Frank lowered himself carefully into a chair. He started preparing for this long before he got sick. A knot formed in Rachel's stomach. Preparing for what? The room seemed filled with people carrying pieces of a story she hadn't heard yet. And every answer only created more questions. Margaret disappeared briefly and returned carrying a wooden box. Unlike the metal box from the bakery, this one looked newer. Polished oak. Well maintained. A brass plaque attached to the lid carried a simple inscription. "For Rachel Harper." Rachel's pulse quickened. Again. Another box. Another message. Another piece of a puzzle she still couldn't see. Margaret carefully placed the box in Rachel's lap. "You were supposed to receive this only if you found us." Rachel stared at it. The room remained silent. Waiting. Encouraging. Almost ceremonial. Slowly, Rachel lifted the lid. Inside rested several documents. A leather journal. And an envelope. The envelope immediately caught her attention. Because written across the front were 6 words. "Open this when you doubt yourself." Rachel swallowed hard. Her throat suddenly felt tight. Over the past year, she had doubted herself almost every day. As a wife. As a mother. As a provider. As a person. The divorce had done that. The custody battle had done even more. Failure has a way of becoming a voice inside your head. One that grows louder the longer you listen. Rachel carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page. Her grandfather's handwriting. She recognized it instantly. "Rachel. By now you've probably convinced yourself that life has defeated you." Her eyes widened. The words felt almost painfully accurate. "If so, you're wrong." The room disappeared around her as she continued reading. "People mistake setbacks for endings. They aren't the same thing. A storm can destroy a roof. It cannot destroy the foundation beneath it. Rachel stared at the page. Something inside her shifted. Only slightly. But enough. Because for months she had been measuring her worth by everything she had lost. Her marriage. Her home. Time with Ethan. Her confidence. Perhaps she had forgotten there were things she still possessed. Things no court could take away. No divorce could erase. No failure could destroy. I've learned that one of the hardest lessons in life is understanding the difference between being broken and feeling broken. The two are not always the same. Rachel folded the letter carefully. For the first time in months, she felt something that resembled strength. Small. Fragile. But real. Then the journal caught her attention. The cover showed years of wear. Its corners were faded. Its pages thick. Rachel opened it. The first page contained a title. Nothing more. Just 3 words. The Hawthorne Promise. The residence immediately grew quiet. More quiet than before. Margaret looked down at the floor. Frank removed his glasses. Several others exchanged uneasy glances. Rachel noticed. And suddenly understood something important. This wasn't merely history. This was something everyone in the room cared about deeply. Something personal. Something unfinished. Before she could ask another question, the front doors burst open. The sound echoed through the lobby. Everyone turned. Rain blew inside. And standing in the doorway was a tall man in a dark overcoat. 70 years old. Sharp eyes. Gray hair. A face Rachel recognized immediately. Victor. No one spoke. The room seemed to stop breathing. Victor looked directly at Rachel. Then at the journal in her hands. A flash of concern crossed his face. Not anger. Concern. As if something had just happened that he had desperately hoped to prevent. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the entire lobby. Rachel. The warmth vanished from the room. You need to leave. The room fell silent. Even the crackling fireplace seemed quieter. Rain continued tapping against the windows, but inside Hawthorne Haven, every eye was fixed on Victor. Rachel remained seated, the journal resting in her lap. For the first time, she saw him clearly. Not through old photographs. Not through warnings. Not through assumptions. The man standing before her looked exhausted. His expensive overcoat was soaked from the storm. His shoulders sagged slightly. The sharp confidence she remembered from family gatherings seemed worn down by something heavier. Something older. Victor took a slow breath. Please, he said. His voice was lower now. Less commanding. Close the journal. No one moved. No one spoke. Margaret folded her arms. Frank stared at the floor. Rachel noticed something strange. The residents weren't afraid of Victor. They were angry with him. There is a difference. Fear looks downward. Anger looks directly at you. And everyone in that room was looking directly at Victor. Rachel slowly stood. Why? Victor's jaw tightened. Because once you read it, everything changes. The answer only deepened the mystery. Rachel looked down at the worn leather cover. The Hawthorne Promise. A title. Nothing more. Yet somehow it carried enough weight to make an entire room uneasy. Slowly, she opened the journal. Victor closed his eyes. As if he already knew he had lost. The first pages contained handwritten entries from nearly 30 years earlier. Most were written by her grandfather. Some by Victor. Others by names Rachel didn't recognize. The entries described meetings. Plans. Financial reports. Construction updates. Fundraisers. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Then she reached a page marked with a red ribbon. A paragraph had been underlined. Rachel began reading. Hawthorne Haven was never intended to be a business. It was created to ensure that no elderly person in this county would spend their final years abandoned or forgotten. The room remained silent. Rachel continued. Any profits generated by future development projects are to be permanently reinvested into resident care. This promise shall remain binding regardless of ownership. She looked up. What does this mean? Frank answered. It means your grandfather never built Hawthorne Haven to make money. Rachel frowned. Then why does everyone keep talking about ownership? Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself felt like an answer. Finally Margaret spoke. Because someone changed the plan. Rachel turned toward Victor. His expression darkened. Not with guilt. With regret. The distinction mattered. I've lived long enough to notice that regret ages people differently than time. Wrinkles come from years. Regret comes from choices. And sometimes the second leaves deeper marks than the first. Victor slowly removed his coat. Rainwater dripped onto the floor. For several moments he simply stood there. Then he spoke. I didn't change the plan. Nobody seemed convinced. Rachel wasn't either. Victor looked around the room. At the residents. At the photographs on the walls. At the life he had once helped build. There were debts. Margaret scoffed. There it is. Victor ignored her. There were lawsuits. Investors. Taxes. Repairs. Insurance. His voice remained calm. Measured. As if he had explained this many times before. Hawthorne Haven nearly collapsed 3 separate times. Rachel listened carefully. Because for the first time, Victor wasn't speaking like a villain. He sounded like a man defending decisions he wasn't proud of. The county stopped supporting us. The donors disappeared. The buildings needed millions in repairs. Victor looked directly at Rachel. And your grandfather refused to sell. Rachel glanced down at the journal. That sounded exactly like Harold Whittaker. Stubborn. Loyal. Determined. Sometimes all at the same time. Victor continued. He believed principles could solve everything. And you didn't? Rachel asked. Victor smiled sadly. No. The answer came immediately. No, I believed bills had to be paid. The room fell quiet again. Because both statements could be true. And that made things harder. Life becomes uncomfortable when two people are both partly right. Rachel turned another page. This time she found photographs. Blueprints. Financial records. Maps of the property. Then something unexpected. A sealed envelope. Attached directly to the journal. The handwriting belonged to her grandfather. For Rachel only. Victor saw it instantly. His face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for Rachel to notice. Enough for her instincts to awaken. What is it? She asked. Victor looked away. Don't open it. That answer made her want to open it even more. Margaret nodded toward the envelope. You deserve the truth. Victor shook his head. No. His voice sharpened. For once in your life, listen to me. The room stiffened. Rachel stared at him. The tension felt different now. Before, Victor seemed dangerous. Now he seemed desperate. And desperation often hides something important. Slowly, Rachel broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter. And a photograph. The photograph showed her grandfather and Victor standing beside a younger woman. Beautiful. Dark-haired. Smiling. Rachel had never seen her before. On the back was a handwritten note. Evelyn. Summer 1998. Rachel frowned. The name meant nothing to her. The letter explained why. Rachel. If you've reached this page, then you've discovered more than anyone expected. There is something you need to know about Victor. Rachel looked up. Victor's face had gone pale. For a brief moment, genuine fear crossed his expression. Not fear for himself. Fear of what she was about to learn. Rachel continued reading. Victor was once my closest friend. The room grew still. And the greatest mistake of both our lives began with Evelyn. Rachel's eyes widened. The residents exchanged startled looks. Even Margaret appeared surprised. This was new information. To everyone. She kept reading. What happened afterward divided us for nearly 3 decades. The truth was buried because we believed we were protecting people. We were wrong. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Another page followed. Then another. The handwriting grew shakier. More emotional. And finally she reached a sentence that made her stomach drop. If you're reading this, then Victor may already know that Hawthorne Haven was never the real inheritance. Rachel stopped breathing for a moment. Never the real inheritance? Then what was? Outside, thunder rolled across the dark Indiana sky. Inside, nobody spoke. Because suddenly the retirement community. The bakery. The dollar. The key. The journal. All of it felt like something else. Not the destination. Only the beginning. And Rachel was starting to realize her grandfather had hidden a secret far larger than money. The thunder faded into the distance. For several seconds, nobody in the room spoke. Rachel could hear the ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind her. The crackle of the fireplace. The steady rhythm of rain striking the windows. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet they seemed strangely loud after what she'd just read. Hawthorne Haven was never the real inheritance. The sentence echoed in her mind. Again. And again. Victor stood motionless near the entrance. Margaret remained beside the fireplace. The residents watched Rachel carefully, as though they knew she had crossed an invisible line. The mystery had changed once more. The bakery wasn't the answer. The dollar wasn't the answer. Even Hawthorne Haven wasn't the answer. They were markers along a trail. And the trail was leading somewhere much larger. Rachel lowered her eyes to the letter. The next page began immediately. If I have done my job correctly, you're probably confused. A faint smile touched Rachel's face. That sounded exactly like her grandfather. Even now, years after writing these words, he was somehow managing to sound amused. She continued reading. When people hear the word inheritance, they think of money. That is because money is easy to count. The things that matter most are harder to measure. Rachel remembered sitting in his bakery as a child. She remembered watching him hand free bread to families who couldn't afford groceries. At the time she thought he was simply being kind. Now she wondered if there had been more to it. Sometimes we don't understand the lessons people are teaching us until decades later. I've often thought that wisdom arrives long after the class has ended. Rachel turned the page. The handwriting became more personal. More intimate. You believe you failed. The words struck her immediately. Because they were true. Not every day. Not every hour. But often enough. She had spent months carrying that feeling. The divorce. The court battle. The long nights. The empty apartment. The loneliness. All of it had quietly convinced her she wasn't enough. Not enough as a wife. Not enough as a mother. Not enough as a person. The letter continued. The greatest lie people tell themselves is that their value depends on their victories. It doesn't. Character is revealed by what remains after defeat. Rachel stared at the page. The room around her blurred slightly. Not from tears. From recognition. Because lately, defeat felt like the only thing she had left. Victor finally broke the silence. Harold always liked speeches. The remark sounded bitter. But not cruel. Rachel looked up. Victor's eyes remained fixed on the journal. He spent his life believing people could be saved. Margaret frowned. And you didn't? Victor sighed. I believed some people don't want saving. The answer settled heavily over the room. Neither side responded. Because both perspectives contained a piece of truth. Life rarely offers perfect heroes and perfect villains. Most people carry both strengths and failures. Sometimes at the same time. Rachel had begun realizing that Victor wasn't the monster she'd imagined. That didn't mean she trusted him. Far from it. But she no longer believed the story was simple. She turned another page. A folded map slipped out. Old. Yellowed. Hand-drawn. The paper showed the Hawthorne Haven property. But something seemed unusual. Several areas had been marked in red ink. A maintenance shed. A greenhouse. A small lake near the northern boundary. And one location near the center of the property. A building labeled Founder's House. Rachel frowned. She looked up. What's Founder's House? The reaction around the room was immediate. Several residents exchanged nervous glances. Frank shifted uncomfortably. Margaret looked away. Even Victor's expression changed. That alone told Rachel the building mattered. A lot. What is it? She asked again. Nobody answered. Not right away. Then Frank finally spoke. It's where the original records were kept. Rachel glanced back at the map. Records of what? Frank hesitated. Everything. The answer created more questions than it solved. Rachel unfolded another document. This one wasn't handwritten. It appeared to be a legal agreement. The pages were worn from age. Several signatures lined the bottom. One belonged to her grandfather. Another belonged to Victor. Then Rachel noticed a third name. Evelyn Carter. The woman from the photograph. Again. The mysterious woman seemed connected to everything. Rachel scanned the document. Her pulse quickened. The agreement described ownership rights. Trust structures. Community protections. But one sentence immediately caught her attention. In the event of Harold Whitaker's death, succession authority shall transfer according to the Founder Protocol. Rachel read it twice. Then a third time. Founder Protocol. The phrase appeared nowhere else on the page. What is the Founder Protocol? This time Victor answered. Quietly. It's why you're here. The room grew still. Rachel looked directly at him. What does that mean? Victor rubbed a hand across his face. For the first time, he appeared genuinely tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Your grandfather spent 30 years preparing for this. Rachel frowned. Preparing for what? Victor laughed softly. Without humor. Preparing for you. The statement hung in the air. Preparing for you. Not preparing for the family. Not preparing for the business. Not preparing for investors. For Rachel. The idea felt absurd. Why her? Her cousins were more successful. Her siblings earned more money. Other relatives possessed business experience. Rachel worked long shifts and struggled to pay bills. She'd just lost primary custody of her son. She was the last person anyone would choose to inherit something important. Or so she believed. The letter seemed to anticipate the thought. She turned another page. And immediately found another handwritten note. By now you're probably wondering why I chose you. Rachel's heart skipped. The timing felt almost impossible. The answer is simple. Because everyone else wanted what I owned. You were the only one who cared about who I was. The room disappeared around her. For a moment she was 8 years old again. Standing behind the bakery counter. Asking questions. Listening to stories. Not because she expected an inheritance. Not because she wanted something. Because she loved her grandfather. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Outside, the rain intensified. Lightning flashed beyond the windows. The residents remained silent. Some appeared emotional. Others looked relieved. As though they had waited years for someone to finally read these words. Then Rachel reached the final page in the section. And everything changed. The handwriting was shakier than before. Written near the bottom was a short message. Only one sentence. If Victor is standing beside you, ask him what happened the night Evelyn disappeared. Rachel froze. The room froze. Victor closed his eyes. And for the first time since arriving, the color drained from his face. Because whatever had happened that night, everyone suddenly understood one thing. The answer wasn't buried in financial records. It wasn't hidden inside Hawthorne Haven. It wasn't about money at all. It was about Evelyn. And Victor clearly knew far more than he had admitted. No one moved. No one spoke. The sentence lingered in the room like thunder after a lightning strike. Ask him what happened the night Evelyn disappeared. Rachel slowly lowered the letter. The fire crackled softly behind her. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Somewhere in the hallway, an old clock chimed the hour. Victor remained perfectly still. His face had lost all color. The confident businessman Rachel remembered from family gatherings was gone. What stood before her now was an older man carrying the weight of something he had spent decades trying to bury. Rachel looked directly at him. What happened? Victor didn't answer. Not immediately. His eyes drifted toward the photograph lying on the table. The one showing Harold. Victor. And Evelyn. Smiling. Young. Unaware of everything that would come afterward. I've lived long enough to know that certain memories never truly leave us. People learn to function around them. Work around them. Hide them. But they never disappear. Sometimes all it takes is a single photograph for 30 years to collapse into 30 seconds. Victor finally sat down. Slowly. As though his legs no longer trusted him. For the first time since Rachel met him, he looked old. Very old. Harold shouldn't have written that. His voice sounded rough. Tired. Rachel didn't look away. What happened? Victor stared at the floor. Then finally spoke. Evelyn Carter wasn't just a business partner. Several residents exchanged glances. Rachel already suspected that much. Victor continued. She helped create Hawthorne Haven. His eyes moved toward the old photographs decorating the room. Most people think Harold and I built this place. He shook his head. That isn't true. Evelyn was the reason it existed. Rachel listened carefully. Every word felt important now. Victor folded his hands together. She was a social worker. A stubborn one. Despite everything, a faint smile appeared. She spent years fighting for elderly people nobody cared about. Margaret nodded quietly. As though she remembered. Victor continued. Back then, nursing facilities were closing throughout the county. Funding disappeared. Families moved away. People were being left behind. The room fell silent. Several residents lowered their eyes. Some remembered those years. Others had lived through them. Victor looked toward Rachel. Your grandfather wanted to build housing. Evelyn wanted dignity. And somehow they convinced me to help. For a moment Rachel could almost picture them. 3 younger people trying to build something larger than themselves. 3 people filled with hope. 3 people who still believed good intentions could solve difficult problems. Sometimes they can. Sometimes they can't. What happened to her? Rachel asked. Victor's jaw tightened. The question seemed physically painful. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he stood and walked toward one of the windows. Rain streaked the glass. The dark outline of the property stretched beyond the porch lights. Finally he spoke. "We fell in love with the same woman." The room grew still. Rachel blinked. She hadn't expected that. Neither had most of the residents. Victor let out a long breath. "It sounds foolish now. Two grown men acting like boys." His voice carried no anger. Only regret. Harold loved her. Victor swallowed. "So did I." Rachel looked down at the photograph again. Suddenly everything felt different. The tension. The distance. The bitterness. 30 years of conflict. Not business. Not money. A person. A relationship. A wound that never healed. Victor continued speaking. Not because anyone forced him. Because after carrying something for decades, people sometimes become tired of carrying it. Evelyn chose Harold. The words came quietly. Without resentment. Without bitterness. Almost as if he'd repeated them to himself 1,000 times. Rachel glanced toward the fireplace. Margaret looked away. Frank adjusted his glasses. No one interrupted. Victor stared into the storm outside. "I told myself I accepted it. But I didn't." A painful honesty entered his voice. "I kept working with them. We built Hawthorne Haven together. We raised money. We expanded. We helped people." His shoulders sagged. But underneath it all. He paused. "I was angry." The confession echoed through the room. Not because anger was shocking. Because honesty was. Most people spend years pretending their worst emotions never existed. Victor wasn't pretending anymore. Then his expression darkened. The night Evelyn disappeared changed everything. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. The room seemed to lean forward collectively. Even the residents appeared tense. Waiting. Victor rubbed a hand across his face. It was October. There was a storm. Much worse than this one. Thunder rolled outside as if the weather itself remembered. Victor continued. "We had just finished a fundraising dinner. Evelyn and Harold argued." Rachel frowned. "About what?" Victor hesitated. Then answered. "Expansion." The answer surprised her. Victor noticed. "You expected something romantic." Rachel didn't deny it. Victor shook his head. "No. The argument was about Hawthorne Haven." He pointed toward the property outside. "Evelyn believed we were growing too fast. Harold believed we weren't growing fast enough. Both thought they were protecting people." The explanation felt believable. Painfully believable. Because many important relationships don't break over hatred. They break when two people want different futures. Victor's voice became quieter. After the dinner, Evelyn drove away. She never came home. The room froze. Rachel stared at him. "What do you mean?" Victor closed his eyes. For a second Rachel thought he might not continue. Then he did. "There was an accident." The words landed heavily. Several residents looked downward. Others crossed their arms. Not because they were hearing this for the first time. Because even now it hurt. Victor swallowed. The bridge outside town washed out during the storm. Rachel felt a chill move through her. She knew the bridge. Everyone in the county knew the bridge. Years ago it had been dangerous during floods. Victor's voice cracked slightly. The car went into the river. Silence. Complete silence. Even the fireplace seemed quiet. Rachel stared at him, trying to process what she had heard. An accident. Not betrayal. Not disappearance. Not murder. An accident. Yet something still felt unfinished. Her grandfather hadn't written. Ask Victor about the night Evelyn died. He had written. Ask Victor about the night Evelyn disappeared. The distinction mattered. Harold Whittaker chose words carefully. Very carefully. Rachel looked down at the remaining pages. Then back at Victor. Something wasn't right. Something was missing. And judging by the tension that had suddenly returned to Victor's face, he knew it too. Then Rachel noticed something else. A folded document partially visible inside the back cover of the journal. Hidden. Almost overlooked. She carefully pulled it free. The paper was old. Official. Weathered. Across the top appeared a title. Missing Person Investigation Report. Rachel's heart stopped. Because beneath the title was a date. 3 weeks after the accident. And at the bottom of the first page were 6 words that changed everything. Case remains open and active. Victor saw the document. And for the first time all evening, he looked terrified. The room seemed to shrink around Rachel. The report trembled slightly in her hands. Not because the paper was heavy. Because the truth suddenly was. She stared at the words again. Case remains open and active. The fire crackled quietly nearby. Rain continued falling outside. Yet all Rachel could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. If Evelyn had died in the accident, why would there be a missing person investigation? Why would the case remain open? And why had her grandfather hidden the report inside the journal? Slowly, she looked up. Victor stood frozen. The fear on his face was unmistakable now. Not embarrassment. Not regret. Fear. Real fear. The kind that appears when a person realizes a secret has survived longer than expected. Rachel unfolded the report. The paper smelled faintly of mildew and age. Decades spent inside boxes and filing cabinets had left their mark. The first page summarized the accident. The storm. The flooded bridge. The vehicle. The river. Everything matched Victor's story. At least at first. Then she turned the page. And the details began to change. Vehicle recovered. Driver not recovered. Rachel swallowed. The report continued. Search teams had located Evelyn's car 2 miles downstream. The driver's side door had been open. Personal belongings remained inside. Her purse. Her wallet. Even her coat. But Evelyn herself had never been found. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. The river had been searched repeatedly. Divers had entered the water. Helicopters had flown overhead. Volunteers had combed miles of shoreline. Nothing. No body. No evidence. No explanation. Just absence. I've learned that uncertainty creates a different kind of grief. When someone dies, painful as it is, eventually the mind accepts reality. But when someone disappears, part of the heart keeps waiting. Keeps wondering. Keeps listening for footsteps that never come. Rachel glanced toward Victor. His eyes remained fixed on the report. Almost as if he already knew every word. Perhaps he did. The next page contained interview summaries. Names. Dates. Statements. Rachel skimmed them carefully. Police officers. Witnesses. Volunteers. Local residents. Then she stopped. One name stood out immediately. Victor Langford. She began reading. According to the report, Victor had been one of the last people to see Evelyn alive. The statement itself wasn't shocking. He had already admitted attending the fundraiser. But another detail caught Rachel's attention. Victor claimed Evelyn left alone shortly after 10 o'clock. Yet another witness reported seeing Evelyn speaking with an unidentified individual near the parking area shortly before departure. Rachel frowned. The witness description was vague. Rain. Darkness. Distance. Nothing conclusive. Still, investigators considered the discrepancy important enough to note. Rachel slowly lowered the page. The room felt colder. Victor. His shoulders stiffened. Who was she talking to? Victor didn't answer. Not immediately. That alone told Rachel enough. Margaret stepped forward. Tell her. Victor remained silent. Frank spoke next. She deserves the truth. Again, silence. Victor rubbed his forehead. For a moment he looked exhausted beyond words. Then finally he sat down. Slowly. Like a man surrendering to something inevitable. I don't know who she was talking to. The answer came quietly. Rachel studied him. He wasn't angry. Wasn't defensive. Just tired. Very tired. You never told the police that, Rachel said. Victor nodded. No. Why not? His eyes moved toward the window. Toward the storm outside. The same kind of storm that had raged 30 years earlier. Because I was afraid. The confession surprised everyone. Including Rachel. Powerful men rarely admit fear. At least not willingly. Victor continued. I spent months convincing myself it didn't matter. His voice sounded distant now. As though he were speaking to memories rather than people. The investigation kept asking questions. They kept returning. They kept looking. Rachel listened carefully. Every sentence felt like another door opening. And eventually, she asked. Victor laughed softly. A humorless sound. Eventually everyone wanted answers I didn't have. Rachel looked back at the report. Another section had been highlighted by her grandfather. She turned to it. The highlighted paragraph described an anonymous phone call received 3 weeks after the accident. The caller claimed Evelyn was alive. The tip could not be verified. The source was never identified. The investigation continued. Rachel stared. Alive. The word changed everything. Again. Another twist. Another possibility. Another reason the case remained open. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Even the residents appeared shocked. Some clearly had never seen this document before. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Rachel continued reading. The anonymous caller provided one additional piece of information. A location. A small rural property nearly 40 miles from Hawthorne Haven. Investigators searched the area. Nothing was found. Case unresolved. Rachel's pulse quickened. Because attached to the report was a photograph of the property. An old farmhouse. Weathered. Remote. Surrounded by trees. And in the corner of the image stood something familiar. A greenhouse. Rachel immediately remembered the map from the journal. The map had marked a greenhouse. One of the locations highlighted by her grandfather. The realization struck her instantly. The clues were connected. The map. The report. The farmhouse. The greenhouse. Harold had been trying to guide her somewhere. Then another thought arrived. One that made her stomach tighten. Why now? Why leave these clues for Rachel? Why not reveal the truth while he was alive? The answer came from a voice behind her. Quiet. Fragile. Old. Margaret. Because he ran out of time. The room fell silent. Margaret slowly sat down. Her eyes glistened with tears. He was still searching when he died. Rachel looked at her. What do you mean? Margaret swallowed. For several seconds she struggled to speak. Then she managed it. Harold never believed Evelyn died. The statement landed heavily. He spent 30 years trying to find out what happened. Rachel's breath caught. 30 years. 3 decades. All this time. All these clues. All these preparations. Not for money. Not for property. For answers. Victor lowered his head. And for the first time, Rachel noticed something she had missed before. Guilt. Not the guilt of a criminal. The guilt of a survivor. The guilt of someone who spent years wondering whether a different decision might have changed everything. Sometimes guilt can become its own prison. I've seen people serve life sentences inside their own hearts without ever entering a courtroom. Rachel looked back at the report. One final item remained clipped to the last page. A handwritten note from her grandfather. Short. Simple. Direct. If you have reached this point, go to the greenhouse. Do not go alone. And whatever Victor tells you next, listen carefully. Rachel's eyes lifted toward Victor. So did everyone else's. The old businessman sat motionless. Defeated. As though he had spent 30 years trying to outrun this exact moment. Finally, he spoke. His voice barely above a whisper. There was something I never told the police. The room froze. Rain hammered against the windows. Thunder rolled in the distance. And Rachel suddenly knew that whatever came next would change the entire story. The storm had grown stronger. Rain lashed against the windows of Hawthorne Haven. Wind rattled the old glass. The fireplace crackled behind Rachel, but it no longer felt warm. Every person in the room was focused on Victor. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They simply waited. Victor sat in silence for several seconds. His hands rested on his knees. Rachel noticed they were trembling. Not much. Just enough. Enough to reveal how difficult this moment truly was. Finally, he lifted his head. There was something I never told the police. The words hung in the air. Rachel thought about the missing person report. The accident. The anonymous phone call. The 30-year search. All of it suddenly seemed connected. What was it? She asked quietly. Victor exhaled. A long, weary breath. The night Evelyn disappeared. He paused. His eyes fixed on the rain beyond the window. She came to see me before she left. The room went still. Margaret closed her eyes. Frank lowered his head. Several residents exchanged startled glances. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Victor had just contradicted his own statement from decades earlier. You lied. The words escaped before she could stop them. Victor nodded. Yes. No excuses. No argument. Just acceptance. I lied. For a long moment nobody spoke. Rachel thought she should feel angry. Instead she felt something closer to sadness. Because Victor looked like a man who had been carrying a stone inside his chest for 30 years. And that stone was finally becoming too heavy. What happened? Rachel asked. Victor swallowed. Evelyn asked me to meet her behind the fundraiser hall. His voice sounded distant now. Almost detached. As though he were replaying a memory he'd watched 1,000 times. It was raining. Not as hard as later. But the storm was coming. Rachel listened carefully. Every detail mattered. Victor continued. She told me she was leaving. The room froze. Leaving where? Rachel asked. I didn't know. His answer came immediately. She wouldn't tell me. Victor rubbed his hands together. She said there were things she needed to do. Things she had discovered. Rachel frowned. What things? Victor shook his head. I don't know. Again, the answer felt genuine. Not evasive. Not calculated. Just frustratingly incomplete. I've noticed that many mysteries survive because the people involved never possessed the entire truth. One person knows one piece. Another knows something else. And years later everyone mistakes fragments for the whole story. Rachel was beginning to suspect that was exactly what had happened here. Victor looked toward the journal. Then toward the photograph. Evelyn gave me something. Rachel immediately sat forward. What? A key. The room seemed to hold its breath. A key. Another key. Another clue. Another piece of a puzzle stretching back decades. Victor nodded slowly. She told me to keep it safe. And? Victor's expression darkened. And I failed. The answer surprised everyone. Victor stood and walked toward the fireplace. The orange light flickered across his face, making him look older. More vulnerable. 3 days after the accident, someone broke into my office. Rachel's heart skipped. What? Victor nodded. The key was gone. No one spoke. The storm roared outside. Thunder rolled across the Indiana countryside. Victor stared into the fire. I never told Harold. Rachel frowned. Why? Victor laughed softly. Without humor. Because Harold already blamed himself. The answer landed heavily. Victor continued. He believed the argument caused her death. I believed losing the key might have destroyed the only chance of finding her. His voice cracked slightly. The sound startled everyone. Victor wasn't a man who seemed accustomed to showing emotion. Yet the years were beginning to show. And sometimes age strips away the energy required to keep pretending. Rachel looked down at the report again. Something suddenly occurred to her. Did my grandfather know about the key? Victor nodded. Eventually. And? Victor closed his eyes. And he spent 30 years looking for it. Rachel felt a chill move through her. 30 years. Not searching for money. Not searching for land. Searching for a key. The realization changed everything. Because keys only matter when something important remains locked. What did it open? She asked. Victor looked directly at her. I never found out. The answer sounded honest. Which somehow made it more unsettling. Then Victor said something unexpected. Something that changed Rachel's entire view of him. I wasn't searching because of Hawthorne Haven. Rachel frowned. Then why? Victor hesitated. For the first time all evening, genuine pain crossed his face. Evelyn was my friend. The words came quietly. Almost fragile. I loved her. No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. Because the sincerity was impossible to miss. Victor looked down at the floor. When she disappeared, part of my life disappeared with her. Rachel saw something then. Not a villain. Not an enemy. A man trapped inside a moment he never escaped. That didn't make him innocent. It didn't erase the lies. But it made him human. And sometimes humanity is harder to confront than evil. Then Victor's expression changed. Suddenly. Abruptly. As though he remembered something. He looked directly at Rachel. For the first time, urgency entered his voice. You need to leave Hawthorne Haven. Rachel stared at him. We already had this conversation. No. Victor shook his head sharply. This is different. The room grew tense. Margaret frowned. Frank gripped his cane. Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. Victor stepped closer. There are people watching. The words immediately brought her back to the phone call. The bakery. The feeling of being observed. Rachel's pulse quickened. What people? Victor hesitated. Then answered. The people who took the key. The room went silent. Rachel stared at him. You're saying someone has been protecting this secret for 30 years? Victor nodded. Not protecting. His face hardened. Controlling. A cold feeling spread through Rachel's chest. Because suddenly several pieces began fitting together. The break-in. The anonymous phone call. The missing records. The hidden clues. Someone had been following the story all along. Not casually. Intentionally. Patiently. For decades. Victor lowered his voice. They knew Harold was searching. They knew I was searching. And now they know you're searching. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. How? Victor looked at her. Then at the journal. Then at the map. You think it was coincidence that I found you at Hawthorne Haven? The room became very quiet. Too quiet. Because everyone suddenly understood what he was implying. He hadn't been watching Rachel. Someone else had. And they had told him. Before Rachel could ask another question, the front doors burst open. The sound echoed through the lobby. Everyone jumped. A young maintenance worker rushed inside. Breathing hard. Rainwater dripped from his jacket. His face had gone pale. Margaret. The entire room turned. What is it? She asked. The young man swallowed. Then pointed toward the northern edge of the property. Toward the location marked on Harold's map. Toward the greenhouse. His voice shook. Somebody's been inside. The room froze. Then came the second sentence. The one that made Rachel's blood run cold. And I think they were looking for something. The room erupted into motion. Chairs scraped across the floor. Voices overlapped. Questions filled the air. The maintenance worker stood near the doorway, breathing hard, rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the tile. Margaret stepped forward first. What happened? The young man swallowed. I was checking storm drains. He pointed toward the darkness outside. Near the greenhouse. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. The greenhouse. The same location marked on Harold's map. The same location connected to the missing person report. The same location mentioned in the final note. Go to the greenhouse. The coincidence was impossible. This was where the trail had been leading. The worker continued. The side door was open. Frank frowned. It should have been locked. It was. The answer came immediately. I checked it yesterday. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over a room when everyone reaches the same conclusion at the same time. Someone had entered intentionally. And recently. Victor's face hardened. We're too late. Rachel looked at him. What does that mean? Victor didn't answer immediately. That worried her more than any answer could have. 10 minutes later, they were moving through the storm. Rachel. Victor. Margaret. The maintenance worker. And 2 residents who insisted on coming despite everyone's objections. The rain had eased slightly, but the wind remained fierce. Flashlights cut through the darkness. The narrow path wound through trees and across wet grass. Mud clung to shoes. Branches swayed overhead. The entire property felt different at night. More isolated. More mysterious. Rachel pulled her coat tighter. The cold air bit at her cheeks. As they walked, she found herself thinking about her grandfather. 30 years. 30 years spent searching for answers. 30 years following clues that never quite led where he hoped. Most people would have given up. Most people would have accepted uncertainty. Harold Whittaker hadn't. Maybe that was why she'd always admired him. Not because he was successful. Because he stayed loyal to questions that mattered. I've learned that persistence often looks foolish right before it becomes important. The world tends to admire determination only after it succeeds. Before then, it usually resembles stubbornness. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and pine trees. Rachel could hear water dripping from leaves overhead. Then the flashlight beams found the greenhouse. It stood near the northern edge of the property. Old. Weathered. Larger than Rachel expected. The glass panels reflected brief flashes of lightning. Several sections had been repaired over the years. Others showed their age. The structure looked like something caught between survival and decay. The side door hung partially open. Exactly as the maintenance worker described. Victor stopped walking. Rachel noticed immediately. His face had gone pale. Not terrified. Not panicked. Just deeply unsettled. As though he recognized something. Margaret noticed too. "You've been here before." It wasn't a question. Victor nodded. Slowly. Many times. No one spoke. The answer alone created a dozen new questions. Rachel pushed the door open. The hinges groaned softly. The smell hit her first. Damp soil. Fertilizer. Wet wood. Living plants. The scent felt surprisingly comforting. Yet something was wrong. Immediately wrong. Flower pots lay overturned. Tools scattered across the floor. Storage cabinets hung open. Someone had searched this place. Not casually. Thoroughly. Desperately. The scene reminded Rachel of photographs she'd seen after burglaries. People searching for something specific. Something valuable. Something hidden. The group moved carefully through the greenhouse. Flashlights swept across rows of plants. Tables. Shelves. Storage bins. Victor headed directly toward the back. Without hesitation. Without needing directions. Rachel noticed. So did Margaret. Interesting. Very interesting. Sometimes people reveal their secrets by where they walk when nobody tells them where to go. Victor stopped near an old workbench. Its surface was covered in dust. Gardening tools hung neatly on the wall above. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then Victor knelt. Rachel watched him press against the side of the bench. A hidden panel slid open. Everyone froze. Frank whispered softly. "Good Lord." Behind the panel sat a narrow compartment. Hidden. Invisible unless you knew where to look. Victor stared at it. Empty. Completely empty. His shoulders sagged. As though the sight confirmed his worst fear. Rachel stepped closer. What was supposed to be here? Victor looked up slowly. His eyes carried 30 years of disappointment. The box. Rachel's heart skipped. What box? The one Evelyn hid. The rain intensified outside. Water rattled against the greenhouse roof. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Margaret broke the silence. Harold knew? Victor nodded. Eventually. Rachel frowned. You knew where this was the whole time? Victor laughed bitterly. The compartment? Yes. The contents? No. The distinction mattered. Victor stood slowly. Evelyn told me she hid something here. What? I never knew. Again, the answer sounded truthful. Frustratingly truthful. She said if anything happened to her, the box would explain everything. Rachel felt chills move through her. Everything. A single word. Yet powerful enough to fuel 3 decades of searching. Then something caught Rachel's eye. A small metal object beneath the workbench. Partially hidden in mud. Almost invisible. She crouched and picked it up. Cold metal touched her fingers. A key. The object fit easily in her palm. Smaller than the bakery key. Older than the brass key Victor described. Everyone gathered around. Victor stared at it. His expression changed immediately. Shock. Genuine shock. That's impossible. Rachel looked at him. What? Victor pointed toward the key. Evelyn wore that around her neck. The greenhouse fell silent. Rachel examined it carefully. The metal showed years of wear. Attached was a tiny silver tag. So small she almost missed it. She brushed away dirt. Then held it beneath her flashlight. Engraved on the tag were 4 words. Founders House Archive Room. The entire group froze. Rachel remembered the map. The location. The building. The records. Another clue. Another door. Another step forward. Harold's trail continued. Then a sound echoed through the greenhouse. A sharp metallic clink. Everyone turned. Something had struck the glass outside. Rachel moved toward the nearest window. Darkness. Rain. Trees. Nothing else. Then she saw it. A vehicle. Parked beyond the tree line. Half hidden. Its headlights switched off the instant she noticed. The engine started. A second later, the vehicle accelerated away into the storm. Rachel's stomach tightened. Someone had been watching. Watching them. Watching the greenhouse. Maybe even listening. Victor rushed toward the window. Too late. The vehicle disappeared into the darkness. No license plate. No details. Nothing. Only confirmation. They weren't alone in this search. And they never had been. Rachel looked back down at the key in her hand. The tiny silver tag glinted beneath the flashlight. Founder's House. The archive room. The next clue. The next destination. Yet as everyone prepared to leave, something else caught her attention. Inside the hidden compartment. Taped to the back wall. A single yellowed envelope. So small it had been overlooked. Rachel carefully peeled it free. The handwriting on the front belonged to Harold. Only one sentence appeared. Nothing more. Nothing less. If you found this after the box is gone, then we're running out of time. Rachel felt a chill crawl up her spine. Because for the first time since this journey began, it sounded like her grandfather had anticipated failure. And whatever waited inside Founder's House, someone else was already trying to reach it first. The storm had passed by morning. After a night of rain and restless thoughts, Hawthorne Haven seemed transformed. Sunlight filtered through the clouds. Water sparkled on the grass. The air smelled clean. Fresh. Almost new. Rachel stood on the porch outside the main building with a cup of coffee warming her hands. She hadn't slept much. Too many questions. Too many clues. Too many years of secrets waiting for answers. The small key rested in her coat pocket. The one they had found inside the greenhouse. The one labeled Founder's House Archive Room. Inside the building, Victor was already waiting. So was Margaret. Frank. And several residents. No one had suggested delaying. After 30 years, another day felt too long. Founder's House sat near the center of the property. A modest brick building surrounded by oak trees. Nothing grand. Nothing impressive. If Rachel had driven past it a week earlier, she probably wouldn't have looked twice. Yet sometimes the most important places were ordinary faces. Her grandfather understood that. He always had. As the group approached, Rachel noticed something. A bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance. Weathered by time. Almost forgotten. She brushed dirt from the surface. Then read the inscription. Every person deserves to belong somewhere. Evelyn Carter. Rachel stared at the words. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Margaret smiled softly. She insisted on that plaque. Rachel ran her fingers across the metal. 30 years later, Evelyn's voice still remained. Not through photographs. Not through records. Through the lives she'd touched. Perhaps that was the closest thing any of us come to immortality. The archive room was located in the basement. A heavy steel door blocked the entrance. Old. Solid. Waiting. Rachel removed the key. Her pulse quickened. One last lock. One last answer. The key slid into place effortlessly. A soft click echoed through the hallway. Then the door opened. Inside stood shelves. Hundreds of boxes. Files. Documents. Photographs. Decades of history carefully preserved. The room smelled of old paper and cedar wood. Near the center sat a single wooden trunk. Unlike everything else, it bore no label. No inventory number. No markings. Only a familiar envelope attached to the lid. Rachel's throat tightened. Her grandfather's handwriting. Again. The final message. She opened the envelope carefully. The room fell silent. Rachel. If you're reading this, then you stayed curious. A faint smile touched her face. That sounded exactly like Harold. Good. Curiosity built this place. Curiosity kept Evelyn fighting. Curiosity kept me searching. Rachel swallowed hard. The words felt less like instructions now. More like a conversation. One final conversation between a grandfather and granddaughter. The trunk contains records, agreements, and evidence proving the future ownership of Hawthorne Haven. Victor shifted slightly beside her. Rachel noticed. But continued reading. The community was never meant to belong to investors. Never meant to belong to corporations. And never meant to become a source of profit. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. Frank looked toward the floor. The residents already knew. But hearing Harold's words still mattered. Perhaps truth always matters more when spoken by the person who lived it. Rachel opened the trunk. Inside were legal documents. Trust agreements. Property transfers. Financial records. Everything necessary to secure Hawthorne Haven's future. Everything Harold had spent decades protecting. Everything Victor had feared might disappear. Then Rachel found something unexpected. A smaller box. Hidden beneath the paperwork. Her heart skipped. Carefully she lifted it out. The box was simple. Wooden. Unremarkable. Yet everyone immediately knew it mattered. Rachel opened it. Inside rested a stack of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. And one photograph. The photograph showed Harold. Victor. And Evelyn. The same picture. Only this version was larger. Clearer. And on the back, written in Evelyn's handwriting, were 7 words. Take care of each other when I'm gone. No one spoke. Not even Victor. Because suddenly 30 years of conflict felt heartbreakingly small. 3 young people had built something beautiful together. Then tragedy arrived. And grief slowly transformed into misunderstanding. Rachel opened the first letter. The handwriting wasn't Harold's. It was Evelyn's. The room became very still. The letter explained everything. Not every mystery. Not every detail. But enough. Evelyn had discovered she was seriously ill months before the accident. She had hidden the diagnosis. Even from Harold. Even from Victor. She feared becoming the reason Hawthorne Haven stopped growing. The reason people lost hope. The reason the mission changed. The night of the fundraiser, she intended to tell them both. Then the storm came. Then the accident. Then history unfolded differently than anyone expected. Rachel read page after page. The room remained silent except for her voice. By the end, tears filled more than one pair of eyes. Victor's included. Because for 30 years he had carried guilt for decisions he couldn't change. For words he wished he could take back. For questions nobody could answer. And now, finally, part of the burden lifted. Not completely. But enough. Sometimes closure doesn't arrive because every mystery is solved. Sometimes it arrives because we finally understand which questions no longer need answers. Later that afternoon, Rachel sat alone on a bench overlooking the grounds. Residents walked nearby. Birds moved between trees. Life continued. Peacefully. The way Evelyn would have wanted. The way Harold had hoped. Victor approached slowly. For a moment neither spoke. Then he sat beside her. "I'm sorry." The words came quietly. Rachel looked at him. Years of regret sat behind those two words. Years of mistakes. Years of fear. Years of stubbornness. "I know," Rachel said. Victor nodded. And for the first time, that seemed enough. Not forgiveness. Not erasing the past. Simply understanding. Sometimes understanding is where healing begins. A week later, Rachel returned to Indianapolis. The custody situation wasn't magically fixed. The bills hadn't disappeared. Life remained complicated. Real life usually does. But something inside her had changed. She no longer measured herself by what she'd lost. She measured herself by what remained. Her character. Her resilience. Her love for Ethan. Her ability to keep moving forward. The things Harold had been trying to teach her all along. A month later, she accepted a position helping coordinate community programs at Hawthorne Haven. Not because she inherited money. Because she inherited purpose. And for the first time in years, she felt exactly where she belonged. Several months later, while organizing archived materials, Rachel discovered one final surprise. Tucked inside an old ledger. Hidden between 2 pages. A tiny brass key. Smaller than all the others. Attached was a note in Harold's handwriting. Only one sentence. "There is still one story I never finished." Rachel stared at it for a long moment. Then smiled. Outside her office window, residents laughed together on the walking path. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the property. Life moved forward. As it always does. And somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her grandfather laughing. Leaving behind one final mystery. Not because he wanted answers. Because he understood something important. The best inheritances aren't money. They aren't buildings. They aren't even secrets. They're reasons to keep going. I've lived long enough to know that families often carry hidden stories beneath the surface. Some painful. Some beautiful. Most a little of both. And perhaps that's the question worth carrying forward. How many lives are changed because one person chooses to keep looking when everyone else decides to stop?